Lars Sørensen was a cross-country, ski-loving and super fit marathon man who also happened to be the CEO of Novo Nordisk in Denmark until 2016 when he was ousted. He was famous for his passion project, curing diabetes, saying to the Harvard Business Review, who had just voted him CEO of the Year, that if we cure diabetes and destroy a big part of our business, we can be proud. He didn't use private jets and was one of the lowest paid pharmaceutical CEOs around. He was also famous for stating in 2005 that obesity is primarily a social and cultural problem. It should be solved by a radical restructuring of society. There is no business for Novo Nordisk in that area. Well, how wrong was he? Welcome to Investigating Ozempic. Hi, I'm Bern, and welcome to episode 2 of Investigating Ozempic. If you haven't had a chance, go back and listen to episode 1 first, because it contains 3 of the first puzzle pieces that you're going to need to know. This podcast is kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, and every piece is important. You might be wondering why I'm looking at the CEOs of Novo Nordisk. And there's a pretty good reason, and I think you'll probably understand it by the time I've finished. It's got to do with the timing, and it's got to do with the different personalities and the different drives that these CEOs have had. Coincidentally, they're both named Lars, which is a very Danish name. The other thing we're going to look at today is the stock market and the meteoric rise of the Novo Nordisk share. And that's got to do with the success of Ozempic and Wegovy. You're basically looking at the 4th and 5th puzzle pieces. Lars Sørensen started at Novo Nordisk in 1982. He took over as CEO of Novo Nordisk Pharma in 2000. He's a forestry graduate and has a master's degree in business. In 2015, his annual salary was 26.8 million Danish kroner. Plus, he received shares of 16.4 million Danish kroner. He earned approximately another $500,000 in payments from being on other boards. So back in 2016, Goran Ando was the chairman of the board. And what happened was the share price fell considerably. Goran Ando said in the 2016 annual report, 2016 was not a good year. We started the year on a share price of 399.9 kroner and ended on 254.7. That is the brutal fact. The drop was caused by a lowered growth expectations for our business in the US, which accounts for around half of Novo Nordisk's total sales. Regrettably, this meant they had to lay off close to 1,000 of their 42,000 colleagues in the autumn. In November 2016, Novo Nordisk reduced its global workforce by 2% across its organisation. The decision was one of several actions to reduce operating costs in response to the challenging competitive environment, especially in the USA. On the 1st of September 2016, the Board of Directors announced a massive shake-up to Novo Nordisk's executive management, including a change of CEO. So Lars resigned. He had a contract until 2019, but he resigned. He worked there at Novo Nordisk between 1982 and 2016. He accepted a US $10.7 million golden handshake, and then in 2018, he went on to head the Novo Nordisk Foundation. The Novo Nordisk Foundation is a philanthropic organisation. They give away millions of dollars in grants, particularly to scientists. We'll go into that more a little later on. What I want you to remember about Lars is his long-term career in the drug industry. That's a lot of experience. The other thing I want you to be aware of is his passion. His passion was for diabetes. He was really intent on finding a cure. And the third thing I want you to remember is the date of when he left as CEO or when he resigned as CEO. It was in September of 2016. As I believe he was gone by the end of that year. So those are the three things to remember about Lars Sørensen. I'm going to call him Old Lars. The second Lars that I want to talk to you about, or young Lars, is Lars Jorgensen. Lars joined Novo Nordisk in 1991. He is a slim man who likes kayaking and spin classes. He's got a master's in finance and business administration. Young Lars took over as CEO in 2017, where he earned 22.4 Danish kroner million plus shares of 4 million Danish kroner. By 2023, he was earning 68.2 million Danish kroner. Young Lars sits on multiple boards, including Denmark's National Bank, and he is president of the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. Time magazine does an article on him as one of the most influential people in health. Lars is quoted as saying that he decided to take a risk in 2017 and go down the weight loss route, even though weight loss drugs had been very problematic before. The Financial Times declared him Person of the Year in 2023 and talks about how the clinical trials for Wegovy was one of the first big decisions that young Lars made after taking over as CEO in January 2017. It also says in that article that the move carried substantial risk. It can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to test a drug, and there was no guarantee that the results would demonstrate success. Young Lars has always talked about obesity as a disease. That is the line that he has always taken, that obesity is a disease and these drugs can help aid people who are suffering from that disease. The three things that I want you to take away from young Lars, or about young Lars, are that his attitude towards obesity is that it is a disease. It seems to be his focus. The second thing I want you to take away is the start date. He started as CEO the 1st of January 2017, I believe. The third thing I want you to remember is that he stepped in after the share price had taken a substantial dive. He is claiming to have taken the gamble to put the clinical trials for Wegovy into action. Now, the reason I'm so obsessed with the dates that these two CEOs came and left the company is that it corresponds to a gap. And it's a gap in time between when the Ozempic clinical trials finished and when the Wegovy trials started. It's approximately 2 years. And it goes from 2016 to 2018. And what happens in the middle of that gap? They change CEOs. Now, I wonder if old Lars, who was always very pro finding a cure for diabetes, I wonder if he wasn't as enamored with the idea of doing a standalone weight loss drug. He said in a 2023 podcast that he hesitated about jumping into weight loss trials because he didn't want to taint a good diabetes drug. He also said the reason that he changed his mind was it was a composite of patient consideration, but also pursuing a commercial opportunity for the company. Now, I'm not sure if he changed his mind because he was not the one who put those Wegovy weight loss trials into action. It was young Lars. So that made me wonder about why old Lars was hesitant. One of the first places that I looked are the Ozempic clinical trials. Now, they weren't called Ozempic trials at the time. They were called Sustain. And we're going to be going into clinical trials an awful lot more in the next episode. But I wanted to take a look at those trials because I wanted to see what old Lars knew at the time. I wanted to see the amount of weight loss that had been lost in those trials. Admittedly, these trials were with diabetics, so it possibly might have affected it a little bit, but I wanted to see what he had seen. And also keep in mind that the clinical trials were paid for and conducted by Novo Nordisk. They did the whole shebang on these. By 2016, when old Lars was still CEO, there were approximately 6 of the Sustain clinical trials completed. By now, in 2024, there's approximately 12 of those clinical trials. But when he was still CEO, there were 6 completed with several thousand people tested in total. So he would have had a pretty good idea of what was going on. The goal of these Sustain clinical trials was to test using semaglutide for diabetes. It wasn't about the weight loss. The weight loss was supposedly a side effect. But I was curious to see how much weight loss they had lost on those trials. I could see they're not earth-shattering numbers at all. They were like 3 kilos, 4 kilos, 5 kilos. These trials were held over a period of 30 or 52 weeks. So these are not huge numbers in terms of weight loss. The Sustain 4 trial, for example, which was completed in 2015, tested 2 dosages. It tested a 0.5 milligram dose and a 1 milligram dose. And the weight loss on that trial was 3.47 kilos for the lower dose and 5.17 kilos for the 1 milligram dose. I also noted that the average weight of a person in those trials was approximately around the 90 kilo mark. And generally, there were far more males than females in almost all of these Sustain clinical trials for Ozempic. If I was the CEO of Novo Nordisk at the time and I was looking at those trials in terms of weight loss, I'd be going, yeah, not bad, but certainly not earth-shattering. And yeah, I don't know if I'm going to spend millions of dollars pouring money into that because I don't think that's enough weight loss. That would be my thoughts at the time. I don't know what old Lars thought, but I know he did not push the button on moving forward with the Wegovy clinical trials. There's another thing that old Lars would have known, and he would have known that back in 2008 through to February 2009, they did a dosage trial. And a dosage trial is where you work out the best dose to move forward with when testing a drug. They tested several different dosages at the time. A 0.1 dose, a 0.2, 0.4, a 0.8. They tested up to a 1.6 dose with titration, which means they brought up the dose slowly. What they found that the 1.6 dose made nearly a third of their participants drop out, and they realised that they had to dump that dose at the time. And you might ask why this is relevant. It's because as you increase the dosage, generally weight loss increases. The other thing that increases as you increase the dosage is side effects. And in a clinical trial, they call them adverse events. So in that 1.6 dosage, there were 93.6% of the people at risk of an adverse event, which is a really high number. And most of those adverse events were gastric related. So that's why you saw nearly a third of the participants, 15 of them out of the 47, drop out of that trial. And that's why the 1.6 dosage was dumped. Now, I don't want all the diabetics in the room to start freaking out because this 1.6 dosage trial used a different titration period. It's different to what they advise now. The old one that I'm talking about used a 2-week titration period. It meant the dose went up every 2 weeks. And what we have now is we're commonly advised, I believe, to go up every 4 weeks. So it's different. There's something else really important that you need to realise about this Ozempic dosage trial. When I look at the clinicaltrials.gov website, which is where you can find pretty much any clinical trial, there are some study record dates. And the record dates tell you when the results were submitted, when it was last updated, things like that. So for this trial, it was first submitted June 2008. But the results were not given, or the results were first posted on the 9th month of 2018, which is over 10 years later. Now, that's not allowed. There's a rule with clinical trials that they need to be published within a couple of years. I think in some countries it's 1 year, in some countries it's 2 years. So this 10-year gap is highly unusual. What also makes it unusual is that the results of this were 2018. However, Ozempic was approved in the USA at the end of 2017, a good 6 months earlier. So if you were a reporter looking around trying to see what had happened in the Ozempic dosage trial, you wouldn't have been able to find it because it wouldn't have been posted. So I find that really interesting. We're going to be talking a lot about clinical trials on this podcast because clinical trials are supposedly the proof that a drug works. These are the trials that a drug company holds, and they hold them in 3 stages. Stage 1 is the early stage, stage 2 is the middle stage, and stage 3 is the last stage, and it's the biggest and the most expensive because they're usually testing hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people, to get an answer about whether a drug works and what are the side effects with that drug. So yeah, we're going to be going back and back and back again to clinical trials because they're really important. I just want to sum up about the 2 CEOs, the 2 Lars, young Lars and old Lars. When I look at old Lars, he's got a passion project to cure diabetes. He's seen the results of the Ozempic clinical trials with not much weight loss. Admittedly, these are on diabetic people. He would have seen the issue with the 1.6 milligram dosage in the Ozempic dosage trial and how when you gave people a higher dose, it made them very ill and drop out of the trial. But he also knew that the more that you gave of this drug, the higher the weight loss amount. He didn't want to taint a good diabetic drug. He believed that obesity should be cured by a radical restructuring of society. And the bottom line is he didn't push the button on the Wegovy clinical trials. And what happened is the board asked him to resign, which he did. And they brought in young Lars. He said in several interviews that one of the first things he did was start the Wegovy clinical trials. He also had the attitude, or has the attitude, that obesity is a disease and patients need help with that disease. The question I've got is, why did young Lars push the button when old Lars didn't? What made him think that it would work? Because these clinical trials are going to cost millions and millions of dollars. I understand that he would have been under pressure, great pressure, by the board to increase the share price and to get it going north again. But this is a really big gamble to do these clinical trials for weight loss when you've only seen a fairly modest amount of weight loss in the Ozempic trials. So why did he do it? What made him think it would work? I was really scratching my head about why young Lars chose to take that enormous gamble. I mean, it's a gamble costing millions, if not billions of dollars. And I questioned it even further after I found some pretty significant documents, which I am going to share with you on the podcast, but not right now, because right now we're going to be talking to Dave from the USA about the incredible rise of the share price. Before I start with Dave, I just want to give a bit of a disclaimer. This conversation with Dave is not meant to be taken as investing advice, of course.
My name is Dave Ahern, and I am one of the co-hosts of the Investing for Beginners podcast based out of the United States. And we try to help people learn how to invest and break down complicated stuff for them.
That sounds like a great podcast. Well worth a listen. So we're here to talk about the Novo Nordisk share price and the company. What do you know in terms of them?
They're a company based out of Denmark, and they specialize in insulin care for diabetics. They were founded in the 1920s, I believe, and they were one of the first companies to mass produce insulin on a production level to help diabetics. Novo Nordisk is broken into two parts. There's the pharmacy company, so the company that produces the drugs, and then there's the nonprofit part of the company. And so the shares that people buy, like if I buy Novo Nordisk, I'm actually buying the shares that belong to the pharmaceutical company. And then the owners of the company, which would be the C-suite managers and founders, board members, they're all getting the other shares as well as the company shares. So there's two different share types, if you will.
So the share price at the moment is having a bit of a feeding frenzy, or it has been for quite a few years. Because you know when it started to rise and why it started to rise.
Well, I know why it's rising. If you look at like the 10-year growth of the company, it's grown at around 19% a year over a 10-year period, which may or may not sound like a lot to some people, but that's well above the historical average of the S&P 500, which is what most investors, especially in the United States, kind of use as a benchmark, which is around 10 or 11%. So that's almost double what they've done. Now, in the last 5 years, that growth rate has actually shot up to almost 31%. Those are big numbers. And so all of this is being driven by the craze of the Ozempic and Wegovy, which are part of the GLP-1 or the semaglutide drugs that they put out that are helping people try to manage their diabetes, especially here in the United States. It's become much more of a weight loss drug as opposed to a diabetes drug, but we'll see how that goes.
I know you've got a personal interest in this drug yourself to some extent. Did you want to talk to that, or
Yeah,
feel
absolutely.
comfortable?
So yeah, you bet. So I'm type 2 diabetic. I was diagnosed about 5 or 6 years ago. And so I have a very vested interest in the development of drugs to help me with my disease. Now, mine is self-induced, so I really have no one to blame but myself. But recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, I had a heart attack, and the drugs that I'm taking to help me manage my heart condition are causing my blood sugars to be higher than they were. And so I was controlling them through my diet, and now I cannot. And so now I'm having to take some medication for that. And so the two of the drugs that I'm taking, one of them is $500 a month. The other one is over $300 a month. And that's with insurance. So they're not cheap. And those aren't even the brand name like Wegovy and Ozempic. So these are other medications. They're not tied to Novo Nordisk, but there are the GLP-1s or the semaglutide based drugs. So it's still super expensive.
That is super expensive. I know there's been a lot of controversy in the media in regard to the price of these drugs in the US. I've been listening to Bernie Sanders in particular, who seems to be on a bit of a crusade to try and reduce the prices of these drugs. But we have a very different medical system to what you guys have. I used to live in San Francisco, so I'm well aware, and I did not want to go to the doctor while I was there because it was way too expensive. Now, I just want to go back. There was something interesting that happened to the share price in 2017. It dropped by 40%. Can you see that on your chart at the time? Yeah. Are you aware why that dropped at the time?
I don't remember who it was that pushed through legislation here in the United States, basically capping the price of insulin in the United States. And so Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk were both hit by that pretty hard. And I believe, I can't speak to that specifically time, but I remember that was something that went through. It was very ballyhooed here in the United States. And I know it caused those companies to lose a lot of value overnight.
How much effect do you think share price has on the CEOs?
It's hard. It's hard to say specifically. So, there are a lot of companies, unquestionably, where the stock price drives all the influence in a decision. Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett's sidekick until he passed recently, he was very famous for saying, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And he was very big on, incentives will drive a lot of behavior. And certainly there are lots and lots and lots of companies out there that the behavior is driven by the incentives or the bonuses they get for owning shares of companies. And the more they can drive those up, obviously, the more money they're going to be worth and are going to make. I did do some research on Novo Nordisk about 2 years ago, and I remember reading some of their literature about kind of how they compensate the CEO in particular. And comparatively, now we're talking very large numbers here, so it's not it's not the same as like you and I on the street. So you got to put it in context. But relatively speaking, if you compare how Lars is being compensated versus the CEO for Intel or let's say Visa or MasterCard, he's actually kind of probably getting underpaid, but it's still in the, 20 or 30 million a year that they're making. And the majority of it is from share-based shares. I won't go into all the nitty gritty of the numbers, but basically the way it works is they set targets. And then when the management achieves those targets, most of the compensation they receive is in the form of shares of the company that they work for. Now, the advantage to this is that it's not a lot of air quote cash out the door, so to speak. And the companies that do it the best will set it up such that they have to work there for 5 years, for example, and achieve certain targets over those 5 years. And in theory, that drives up the value of the share price, which as shareholders of you and I own the company, that we like that. And that's good for us. But then the CEO also gets shares of that company, and then they can sell those after a certain period of time. And that's how these people get uber wealthy, is by owning shares of these companies. You look at Elon Musk, for example, richest man in the world, all of his value is tied up in the shares of Tesla, not in the salary that the company pays him, which is, comparatively is not very much. And so that's kind of how these managers make a lot of money, is by receiving shares for the incentives. But if the incentives are not aligned, then that's no bueno at all.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Do you have any idea what the timeline is? Like, how soon after they get their shares are they usually allowed to sell them? Is it like 2 years, 1 year, 10 years?
It'll depend on the company. I remember that the Novo Nordisk had a minimum 3-year rolling period for certain types of shares, depending on what goals they achieved. And then other ones were tied to longer targets, and those were 5 years. But I have seen other companies that have received, they'll receive it in a year, and they vest in a year, and they can go out and sell them on the market for a lot of money. So it just will depend on the company. So Novo Nordisk, like I said, theirs are on a rolling 3-year, and then they have a 5-year for longer term targets.
I did see, when I was looking back at the share price, that the board had voted in terms of incentives. It seemed to be that the board was saying, well, this year it's been a great year. You're getting 100% of your incentive. And I think 2016, which was, the share price dropped by 40%. They got a percentage of their incentive. I think the remuneration board had a lot to do with how much was going out in terms of shares, in terms of bonuses. And the funny thing I found a little, and I don't know if this is a common thing with other companies, but the remuneration board consisted of 3 people that were on the board of Novo Nordisk. So I was like, that doesn't seem very, it seems like, well, we're voting to give ourselves more shares. It seems a little
Right.
conflict of
Yeah.
interest. Yeah.
Yeah. There can be a lot of, I guess, misaligned incentives is a polite way of saying it. It can really depend. So I'll give you a couple examples. Company called BlackRock Investments. It's a huge investment firm, is basically run by one man, and he's the CEO. He's also the chairman of the board, and he's also the only person that is on the remuneration board, or the pay board. So he's the one giving himself the bonuses. And, like, really? I mean, it just, you don't see that very often. That's pretty unusual, because that is so not, it's not good.
No, it's not.
It's
I
not,
mean,
it's not a good look at all.
I'm going to go back and check who's on that remuneration board. The share price has obviously gone crazy. People are using this drug like crazy. I don't know if you've had a look at the breakdown on their balance sheets in their annual reports, but the majority of their profit comes from North America.
Yes.
Which, clearly you guys are paying an awful lot for your drugs over there. Do you happen to know how many shares the current CEO owns?
So Lars Jorgensen, he owns 92,800 shares. So quite a bit, which of the company is 0.002%. So very small, but those shares are worth 75 million Danish krona.
Yeah, that's a big incentive. That's a
Yep.
big house.
Yep. It sure is.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that that's pretty common in pharma companies, isn't it? I mean, I've heard that the CEO of Eli Lilly, which is obviously their largest competitor at the moment, and they're based in the US, their share price would have been flying as well, I'd well imagine. But I believe
Yep.
their CEO gets paid an awful lot more than what the Danish guys do. Yeah.
Yes.
What do you see happening with their share price? If you've got a magic ball, what are your guesses in what's going to go on?
I think there's a few things you probably want to think about when you think about that. Number one, you mentioned that the majority of their sales is in the United States. And I'm going to bash my country here for just a second. We are not a fit country. We are overweight. The rates of diabetes and obesity are skyrocketing in our country. And at this point, I don't really see anything on the horizon that's going to interrupt that. And because of that, then companies like Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk are going to have a large, growing, no pun intended, target market to continue to sell their drugs to. Americans also are always looking for the air quote magic pill that's going to make them lose weight. And it appears that something like Wegovy and Ozempic might actually be those things. And so I think there's a long, long runway for those companies to continue to sell to the United States in particular. And I don't see anything on the horizon that could kind of break that spell, if you will. Now, I do know that the patent for both Ozempic and Wegovy expire in 2032. So we have roughly about 7 more years before that exclusivity to these particular drugs wears off, and then generics can start hitting the market. And once that happens, then in theory, some of this will start to subside. At least the prices that the revenue they generate from these particular drugs will start to wane. And so those are the two things that are driving the price. Is there's a lot of opportunity for demand, and there's a long runway for them to continue that demand. When you have those two things in place, I don't see this abating much. There could be bumps in the road. There always is, but I don't think anything's really going to disrupt that ship, if you will.
Yeah. There is something interesting in terms of their patent. I know it's being fought at the moment in China. China are fighting their patent. And I guess, there is a concern possibly in the US that China is going to start manufacturing those drugs within the next couple of years, and possibly they'll start flooding the market. Because, we all love a generic drug. It's usually far cheaper than the original.
Yes.
Is there anything else outstanding about Novo Nordisk that you've noticed, that you've looked at, that you've thought, oh, that's interesting? Is there anything that's unique about them that you found?
I think the one thing that I guess that struck me when I was kind of looking at the company was how singularly focused they have been on curing diabetes. They have other drugs that they have developed, but really their singular focus was on diabetes, and that, I guess, surprised me a little bit. Coming from here in the United States and being around companies like Eli Lilly and Abbott Laboratories and some other ones, that Johnson & Johnson, that have such wide tendrils around lots of different diseases and cures, that I was surprised that Novo Nordisk was that singularly focused.
I think I can possibly throw a little light on that, is the previous CEO, who is another Lars Sorensen. He had a passion project, which was to cure diabetes. So that, that might explain a little bit of that, because I found the same thing when I was looking at them. I'm like, wow, they're really focused on diabetes. But to tell you the truth, since the new Lars, or the young Lars, is, the next one's come in, it seems to be that's really switched around, and they seem to be a GLP company now. I mean, obviously insulin is still a big part of their business, but it seems to be that they've, pivoted to some extent.
Yeah, very much
towards
so.
the
Very
profit.
much so.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
what is the share price valued at today, and what was it valued at, say, 10 years ago?
Right now, it's trading at 748 Danish krona, and if we look 10 years ago, it was trading at 368 Danish krona a share.
So that's doubled.
It's almost doubled. Yeah,
almost
it's over doubled. If your listeners want to learn way more about the company than maybe I've been able to dispel, there is a podcast called the Acquired Podcast, and they did
great. Yeah.
4.5 hour episode on Novo Nordisk, and well worth your time. Super, super interesting. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Totally worth a listen. But so is your podcast, Dave, obviously, which is called
Investing for Beginners. So we've been around we've been around for 7 years. So
wow, that's a while. How many episodes have you got up at the moment?
506.
Wow, that is a lot.
Yes,
a lot to dig through there, and a lot to have a listen to, which is great. I want to thank Dave for coming on and chatting to me about Novo Nordisk's share price, and I've put a link to his great podcast in the show notes. Next week on Investigating Ozempic, we go back in time to the origin of the first GLP-1 drug, liraglutide, and we talk to Laurie about her success story with that drug. Plus, we look further into the controversial documents that question everything I thought I knew about the new weight loss drugs. See you next week on Investigating Ozempic. Investigating Ozempic is written and produced by me, Bernadette Fisher. For full disclaimers, please see the show notes. And don't forget to rate, follow and subscribe. I'd really appreciate that. Thanks. Hey, just one more thing. I've attached in the show notes links to all of the documents that I've talked about, including the Ozempic dosage trial, the Sustain 4 trial, the 2016 Novo Nordisk report, the Time article, Financial Review article, and the Harvard CEO article. So you can find them all there.